All right, so today we're going to be talking about social psychology. We're going to look into why people do horrible things and why people do good things, right? To kind of take things back. We're looking at a lot of those injustices and people that did horrible things in the past, right? Some of them
Can
that
I
we.
add something to this?
What's that?
I'm asking, can I add something to the?
Yeah, go ahead.
What you're talking about, could this possibly, how sometimes people do bad things?
Mm-hmm.
Could we possibly be seeing that in the next couple of days, depending on who's going to win the election?
You mean like with what people are going to be doing in mass groups? Absolutely. And we'll talk about that here a little bit later as far as like the riot mentality. A lot of people that are generally, we would see them doing good things in their lives are doing horrible things out on the streets, right? We look through our history. We're looking through our history right now, right? Slave owners and Nazis and really perpetrators of history's atrocities. How do they successfully dehumanize other people for so long? And at a smaller scale, how do bullies in the lunchroom or a bus, how do they manage to treat other kids with such cruelty and then go home and pet their dog and call grandma and say happy birthday, right? So we see a lot of that. We've for the most part, we've been studying the individual. What covered some of the subfields that we looked at in psychology, like cognitive psychology. We haven't gotten to personality yet because that kind of lumps in with how we are socially. We're going to look at clinical psychology, which tends to address the phenomenon contained within a single person's mind. But there's also social psychology, which focuses on the power of the situation. Okay, so what do I mean by that? It examines how we think about influence and relate to one another in certain conditions, right? And it's better equipped to answer this question about people doing horrible things, people that we would consider that are good people, and we see them do horrible things in society, right? So social psychology can not only give us some of the tools that we need to understand why people behave brutally, it can also help us understand why sometimes we act heroically, like when Jean Valjean revealed his true identity to save some stranger from being tried in his place, right? And why Nazi Oskar Schindler risked his own hide to save over 1,000 Jewish people, right? What made Darth Vader throw the Emperor down that hole, even as he was being electrocuted? I don't know if any of you are Star Trek fans, but that's a good example, right? Especially in the movies. So I can say that there aren't any easy answers about humanity's greatness or its horribleness, but certainly there aren't any that we can find, at least through this lesson. Okay, but we have a lot of theories as to why they come, and we can point ourselves in the right direction, and it really starts with social thinking. All right, so we're trying to understand why people act like villains and heroes. And one of those things we're really asking is, do they do what they do because of their personality, or is it their situation? And Austrian psychologists Fritz Heider began really delving into this question in the late 20s when he was developing what is known as our attribution theory. Okay, and your book kind of talks about attribution theory. I'm sorry, I wanted to let me collect my thoughts here and just pause a second because I want to share my screen so we can have some notes. Okay. So from your reading, what did you know about attribution theory? What did that speak to you? Does anybody care to share? Does anybody have an idea of attribution theory and what it meant? How many of you have experienced road rage? Let me ask that. Say again?
Oh, I'm sorry. That was my husband.
Oh, okay. All right. Does anybody care to share, like, if they've had experienced road rage or upset at somebody on the road, maybe?
I mean, I guess when people cut me off, when it's like my straightaway and they're going left. This happened like 2 days ago, and like the person stops to beep at you in the middle of the road.
Okay, okay. And how did you act in that situation?
I mean, I beeped back. And I
Okay,
got
okay.
aggravated, but I mean, I've seen people take it like a lot worse where they get extremely aggravated.
Yeah, yeah. And what are some of the bad
Yeah.
things you see when people get aggravated?
Fights.
Yeah, it gets violent, doesn't it? Anybody here from New York? I think Pierre might have been from New York, but I don't know. He
Yes.
hasn't chimed in. Yeah. So I love New Yorkers. I think New Yorkers are some of the greatest people around. I live about hour and a half from Manhattan. So I've spent some time in New York, and I'll tell you what, great people, wonderful. They'll give you the shirt off their
Yeah.
backs, but you get them behind the
I've
wheel
been
of
to
the
New
car.
York City 16 times, so I know what it's
Okay,
like.
okay. So you probably know what I mean by this. You get a New
Yeah.
Yorker behind the car, or even somebody in New Jersey, and they lose their minds, right? And a lot of people will use attribution theory, especially behind the wheel of a car. So, put simply, this theory it suggests that we can explain somebody's behavior by crediting their stable, enduring traits, also known as their disposition, or the situation at hand, and we tend to attribute people's behavior to either one or the other. And it sounds pretty simple, right? So two factors that go into this is disposition or like enduring traits, right? Like kind of personality, if you will, kind of mixed in with personality, enduring traits. And also looking at the situation.
Professor, I think we're not able to see what you're sharing right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you for letting me know.
Sure.
Paused. Why is it paused? Resume sharing. How about now? Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. All right. So anyway, but put simply, it's surprisingly hard to tell when somebody's behavior is either dispositional or situational. So let's say, for example, you're at a party and you see Philip, and your buddy Philip, he's acting kind of introverted, kind of like a wallflower all night. And you might assume that he's just maybe shy. Maybe he has a shy personality, but maybe he doesn't. Maybe he would ordinarily be dancing like Shakira at this party on this night, but maybe he had a twisted ankle or a headache, or he had just seen his ex with somebody new. All those are situational explanations for that, right? So what we're doing is we're either applying a situation to like his headache or his twisted ankle, or maybe we're applying disposition, which could be shy. It's one of those two things. And sometimes they overlap, as we'll talk about here in just a second. And overestimating the forces of personality while underestimating the power of situational of the situation is called fundamental attribution error. So what happens with fundamental attribution error? Okay, think of the example of driving your car and somebody cuts you off, and maybe you get out and fight them. Hopefully not. I don't think anybody in this class would do that. But if you did, you might be assuming that that person is being a jerk, right? Maybe you didn't consider they didn't see you, or that they're in a hurry and that they're flustered. Maybe they have a child screaming in the back seat and they weren't focused. Right, but in some cases, not everybody, some people might say that person's being a jerk, and they're going to respond in kind, which would be fundamental attribution error, right? Because we don't have all the information. We're either assigning it to their disposition or we're assigning it to their situation, right? When we assign it to their situation, we tend to think a little bit more empathetically. But when we start thinking that people are intentionally being jerks, that kind of leads us down a bad path. So this might not be such a big deal when it comes to your buddy Philip and his awesome dance moves. But according to one study of college students, 7 in 10 women report that men have misread their polite friendliness, which would be appropriate for the situation, as a sexual come on, right? So what's the problem with that? Why would that be a problem that women might construe that in the study? What does that say? Let me ask you this. In your opinion, why are people homeless? If you see somebody on the street, this is a question to you. If you see somebody on the street that's panhandling or asking for money, or maybe even sitting on the sidewalk not bothering anybody, what is your opinion?
Something bad had happened that led them to where they are.
Okay. How many of you actually give them money?
I do.
You
All the
do?
time. Yes.
Okay.
I
Okay.
Ew.
I have that sympathy.
Okay. So a
Yes.
lot of you have different, probably have different ways of handling this, right? We choose how we explain others' behavior every day, and what we choose to believe can really have big consequences. For example, right now, our political views, they're likely to be strongly influenced whether we decide to attribute poverty or homelessness, right, to personal dispositions. Like being lazy, people might think that they're just being lazy or looking for a handout, or social circumstances like lack of education and opportunity. Those might be reasons. And
Yeah,
these, go ahead.
I know some of these people that they it's not lack of education, but they're highly educated, but there's some circumstance that made them give give up to something, especially when it's come. I know somebody who was married, he had you know many kids, and some situation happened and he divorced his wife, and his wife ruined him. Like she took almost everything, and the guy said, well, he's now gonna, because he invests too much money and time on this relationship, and now that was has happened, and he said there is no point for him again to go back to normal life. He's just gonna, because he paying too much for the church people. He doesn't want any job anymore because he not getting anything back.
Okay.
So he
Oh,
gave up.
okay. So yeah, he kind of just gave up on the stressors, right? And we see
Yeah.
that a lot. We see a lot of people that are out on the streets. They've given up. They don't want the stress of money or bills, or having to worry about a mortgage or family. And that's just a value that they've assigned to their stress. And if the stress becomes too much, then they avoid that stress, right? So it might be kind of an avoidance. But in your situation there, you're talking about a situational attribute, right? You know the story behind that, and you can now, based on now knowing that, you can relate that to what other people might be going through. You're able to break out of that and just say, we're not. That person may not be lazy. That person just had a really rough patch, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and these attitudes can, in turn, affect our actions. Activists and politicians know this. They know it well, and they can use that to their advantage to persuade people in different ways, right? We see it on TV all the time. And in the late 1970s and 80s, a psychologist named Richard Petty and John, I forgot his name, Cacioppo, Cacioppo, developed a dual process theory of understanding how persuasion works. Okay, so let me kind of have to change my color here. Persuasion. All right, so the first part of their model is known as central route persuasion. Okay, so within central route persuasion, it involves calling on basic thinking and reasoning to convince people. Okay, so basic reasoning to convince people. All right. So this is what's at work when people when interested people focus on evidence and arguments at hand. And many of you have probably been on some of these conversations and are persuaded by actual content of the message, right? So when you're watching a political debate, you might be persuaded by the candidate's particular policies, positions, or even their voting history. So that is the stuff that they're actually saying. So let me kind of throw this out to you again. What political ads did you see that really employed looking at like the credibility, the policies and positions that really spoke to you? Does anybody have any examples of something they may have seen on TV?
It wasn't for like the press. It's for like Deep Wally and Scott Perry. Saw a lot of Scott Perry and like how like he did a lot of it was based around polluting the air and stuff with him.
Okay. So kind of looking at his actions and what he has done in the past to do that, right? Okay. Yeah, it's a good example. All right. And that's central route persuasion. But and we know that persuasion involves a little bit more than that. So we, along the side of that, we have peripheral route persuasion. Okay, so this influences people by way of incidental cues, like a speaker's physical attractiveness or personal relatability. And maybe you have seen politicians that are like that, right? Maybe your favorite actor isn't a great actor at all, or actress. Maybe they are, maybe it's just their beauty or their attractiveness that you're really relating to, okay? And there's not a lot of hard thinking going on here. It's more of a gut reaction. So you might decide to vote for a particular candidate because you think they're cute or they're from your hometown, right? We can probably all relate to that a little bit. Peripheral route persuasion happens more readily when you're not paying a ton of attention, which is why billboards and television ads can be scarily effective. So that's how politicians and advertisers and maybe even bosses and teachers and pushy friends try to change our behavior. It's by changing our attitudes. Okay. One of the great examples that I work a lot with book representatives like publishers and salesmen for drug reps, okay, drug companies. And I'll tell you, a lot of them are dressed to the nines. They've got, sometimes they've got gold watches. They've got, you know, a nice tie or a nice blouse or a nice skirt or something. I mean, the hair's done up. They really emanate beauty and attractiveness. Now, why is that? Why do you think sales focuses on attractiveness? Anybody?
What did you say?
Well, why do sales representatives, why are they usually attractive? Why do they emanate attractiveness?
To grab the attention of like the people they're talking to.
Right, to kind of give you credibility, right? And your book talks about the halo effect. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the halo effect, but it's when we perceive somebody to be more of an expert based on their looks or outwardly something other than their central, what we look at in central route persuasion, something other than basic reasoning. We're going to look at somebody and we're going to consider them credible. Like right now, if I wore a lab coat and I started talking about medical stuff that I had no clue what I was talking about, you would assume that I was an expert, right? Even though you may not know what I'm talking about, I just now gave myself credibility. And that's really what goes into peripheral route persuasion, okay? But it turns out that the reverse is also true. Our attitudes can be affected by our behaviors, which you might have heard about the phrase, fake it until you make it, right? Has anybody heard that phrase before?
No.
Okay. It's something that we kind of use when I'm employing positive psychology. This is really important, meaning if you smile, you're actually sad. What when you smile when you're actually sad, the act of smiling can carry you through an attitude change until you actually feel better. Now, there are some fundamental flaws with doing that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But for the most part, it is true that if you smile, you can actually lift up your own spirit, and that could be reflected on somebody else's, right? Sometimes we can manipulate ourselves this way, but it's also an incredibly effective method that people use to persuade each other, right? And you think about that, people that are trying to sell you something, and generally works best in increments through what psychologists call foot in the door. Okay. Now you may have heard of foot in the door, and which happens. People tend to more readily comply with a big request after they first agreed to a smaller, more innocuous request, right? Like Darth Vader. Let's use our Darth Vader example here. Anybody, any Star Wars fans out there, by the way? Anybody? Okay, maybe not. So Darth Vader, I'm going to continue with this analogy because I think some of you are closet Star Trekkers, so I'm not going to hold that against you or ask you to draw yourselves out. But what we know about Darth Vader was Anakin was a good guy, right? And he didn't really turn to Darth Vader overnight, the Darth Lord. He was slowly enticed to the dark side by a series of escalating actions. It took almost 9 hours of video for him to change his attitude, right? Do this favor for me now, run this errand, now kill these little Padawans, right? Now go blow up a planet, right? It started out small and it wound up to the point where his small actions went on to become big ones and suddenly transforming him into Vader's beliefs about himself and others. Now, this is Star Wars, right? But it really exemplifies, it really illustrates a much larger issue at play here. And that's the foot in the door, okay? So there are plenty of experimental evidence that moral action really does strengthen moral convictions, just as amoral actions strengthen amoral convictions. And there's perhaps no better example of this than the Stanford prison experiment, okay? How many of you have heard, I know if you read the book, you've heard of the Stanford prison experiment, right? I'm going to play for you a video just to kind of illustrate what happens. Experiment. Okay, so bear with me. Somebody's off mute. Would you mind just going ahead and muting your? Appreciate that. All right.
And an investigation into the power dynamics that exist between guards and inmates in a prison setting. The object of the Stanford prison experiment was to determine if it was the acquisition of power that made guards turn brutal, or whether brutality was actually intrinsic to human nature itself. The notorious experiment that ensued would kick off decades of academic controversy and suggest some very dark things about the nature of humanity. Today, we're going to take a look at why the Stanford prison experiment might be the most disturbing study ever conducted. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other psychology-related topics you would like to hear about. During the 1970s, both the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were interested in learning about the hierarchies of power in military prisons. Accordingly, the U.S. Office of Naval Research issued Philip Zimbardo a grant to study the relationships between prison guards and prisoners. The objective would be to determine if those relationships were shaped more by the prison environment or the personalities of the guards. The grant would be used to create a mock prison environment in which to conduct the experiment and to pay the participants. The Stanford prison experiment started with an ad Zimbardo placed in the classifieds. It read, "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. 70 people applied. The applicants were interviewed and asked to take personality tests. Anyone who had a criminal record or record of abusing narcotics was eliminated, as was anyone who displayed personality disorders, physical disabilities, or psychological problems. Ultimately, 24 college students, all white and all male, were selected to participate. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. Zimbardo and his team randomly divided the students into two groups, prisoners and guards. There were 12 of each category, 9 that were active participants and 3 that were alternates. On August 17, 1971, the experiment began when the 9 prisoners were arrested by actual police officers from the Palo Alto Police Department. Each person was taken into custody, then had their mugshots taken before being fingerprinted, blindfolded, and moved into a holding cell. Finally, they were taken into a mock prison that had been set up in the basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall. The fake prison felt very real. The researchers who created it had consulted with prison officials and ex-convicts before designing it. The cells were built in a space that was normally used as a laboratory. Each cell had a barred door, a cell number, and room for 3 prisoners. Other touches included a solitary confinement cell that had been created in a closet, and a rule that prisoners had to be blindfolded before being taken to the bathroom. To avoid selection bias, participants were assigned to be either prisoners or guards based on the results of a coin toss. Very different fates awaited each respective group. Guards were given real prison guard uniforms, complete with nightsticks and whistles. Many guards even donned mirrored sunglasses, which were meant to prevent eye contact with the prisoners, or maybe just to look like Boss Godfrey from Cool Hand Luke. Prisoners, on the other hand, were stripped, deloused, and dressed in sandals and an ill-fitting numbered smock. They weren't issued any underwear, but they were given nylon stocking caps, which they were asked to wear in lieu of having their heads shaved. Once dressed, a chain was placed on each of their legs. Prisoners were only addressed by their number and had to refer to themselves and the other prisoners in the same way. It was a recipe for dehumanization and oppression. Zimbardo himself served as superintendent of the prison, and researcher David Jaffe played the warden. The two were responsible for instructing the guards and laying down the scope of their duties. First and foremost, the guards were told to maintain order. To this end, they were allowed to use any means necessary, short of physical violence. Things that were permitted included harassment, the withholding of food, and the deprivation of privileges at the guards' discretion. The guards, unlike the prisoners, were also allowed to work in shifts. The shifts, which each required 3 guards, lasted 8 hours. Off-duty guards didn't have to be at the prison, but were asked to remain on call in case of an emergency. On the first night, the guards decided to use a whistle to rouse the prisoners from their sleep for a head count at 2:30 a.m. Some of the prisoners didn't take the head count seriously, and the guards punished them by making them do push-ups. After a head count, the prisoners had already had enough and decided to rebel. On what was only the second morning of the experiment, they removed the numbers from their uniforms, pulled off their stocking caps, and barricaded themselves inside their cells using their beds. When the next shift of guards arrived in the morning, they were alarmed to find the prisoners yelling curses at them from their cells. They requested reinforcements and made plans to quell the uprising. They brought in the on-call guards, and the night shift volunteered to do extra duty. It was only day 2, and things were already getting ugly. In order to get the cell doors open, the guards used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the barricades. Once that was accomplished, they rushed into the cell, grabbed the prisoner, and stripped them naked as a jaybird. The birthday suit prisoner was then placed into solitary confinement. While they were there, the guards would remove the bed from their cell, meaning the prisoner would have to sleep on the floor when they returned. Once the rebellion was controlled, the guards had to figure out how to prevent another from happening without having to have all 9 guards perpetually on duty. The solution was to divide and conquer. The guards deemed one of the cells the privileged cell. Well-behaved prisoners were placed in the privileged cell, where they would get their uniforms and beds back, and even get special meals. The other prisoners were not only denied of all these things, but were deprived of their normal food rations. After a few hours, the guards would randomly move the prisoners around. The idea was to create confusion and sow the seeds of distrust among the inmates. And it worked.
The new Hyundai Sonata with remote smart parking assist. You won't find that on Accord, Camry.
In the wake of the uprising, conditions deteriorated fast. The guards started making a point of dehumanizing the prisoners by making them call out their identification numbers. Prisoners were also forbidden from using the bathroom at night and were forced to use a bucket in their cell instead. Soon the guards stopped emptying the buckets, reasoning that the bad smell was simply another punishment for misbehavior. Despite what Zimbardo described as frequent reminders from the staff, the guards grew increasingly aggressive. The most egregious behavior occurred when the staff wasn't paying attention, which became stressful and frustrating for the prisoners. The prisoners, as a result, became increasingly submissive, and the experiment was about to claim its first victim. After only 36 hours, prisoner Doug Corpy began suffering from what was described as acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. The guards used this opportunity to try and coax him into becoming a snitch, but when his erratic behavior continued, the staff realized Doug was in genuine distress and needed to be released from the experiment. On the 6th day, Zimbardo convened a mock parole board, which was headed by one of the experiment's prison consultants. Inmates who believed they deserved parole would be allowed to present their case to the board. It was during these presentations that Zimbardo, along with the other researchers, began to theorize that the prisoners no longer saw themselves as participants in an experiment, but as real prisoners. According to Zimbardo, the prisoners had internalized their crimes, as well as their roles as inmates. As for the guards, he came to identify 3 different types. Tough but fair guards, who followed prison rules. Good guys, who did little favors for the prisoners and never punished them. And finally, guards who appeared to thoroughly enjoy the power they wielded. Zimbardo felt this last group was hostile, arbitrary, and inventive in their forms of prisoner humiliation. Zimbardo concluded that most people were ultimately willing to fulfill whatever role they were given in a respective social setting. He even admitted that he had internalized his role as superintendent over his role as a psychologist. At one point, Zimbardo brought in a real priest to talk with the prisoners. It was during this conversation that prisoner 819 broke down sobbing. He was so hysterical that the staff agreed to take him to a doctor. The other inmates, for their part, turned on 819. Researchers offered to send him home, but 819 surprisingly refused, saying that he couldn't leave because the other inmates had labeled him a bad prisoner. Zimbardo was forced to intervene. Pulling the student aside, he forcefully reminded him that he was not really an inmate and that the experiment was not really a prison. The prisoner is alleged to have stopped crying and looked at Zimbardo like a small child awakened from a nightmare. After that, 819 agreed to leave. On the 6th day, a recent PhD recipient named Christina Maslach was brought in to interview the prisoners. Horrified by what she saw, she confronted Zimbardo, asking him how he could see what she had seen and not care about the students who were suffering. According to Zimbardo, he quickly realized she was right. It was at that moment that he decided to prematurely end the study. Later, he would reflect on his own behavior and claim that it wasn't until his discussion with Maslach that he realized how deeply he had internalized his role at the prison. Ultimately, he concluded he was thinking like a prison superintendent rather than a research psychologist. Both the ethics and conclusions of the Stanford prison experiment remain highly controversial. Its scientific rigor has been repeatedly questioned by scientists who have been unable to duplicate its results. And even Zimbardo himself has admitted the whole thing was more of a demonstration than a scientific experiment. A 2018 book by French academic Thibault Letexier dismissed the entire thing as nonsense. He argued that the guards had been told what results they were supposed to produce and were advised and guided by Zimbardo and his staff the whole way through.
All right.
So
what'd you think of that? How many of you have heard that story before? Some pretty powerful stuff. And I'll tell you, it really resonates in a lot of things that we have seen throughout history, right? Throughout our own history here. Let me get back to my screen here. So that was one example of that. And yet, many people differ. And we saw there some people might have broken down as others didn't really, they might have been able to make it to the end of the experiment. But many people succumb to and become compliant in terrible situations, but not everybody does. That's not to say all people are bad. Lots of people risk their lives, for example, to hide Jewish people in World War II, help runaway slaves along the Underground Railroad, and keep Tutsi refugees safe during the Rwanda genocide. Or generally, they refuse to comply or participate in actions that they don't believe in. Some people can, and they do resist turning to like what I guess what we call the dark side, even when it seems like everyone around them is going mad and doing the same thing. And yet the fact is these people, they tend to really be in the minority. So why is this? Why does it seem so many or it's so easy to rationalize a negative action or attitude and so hard to muster the positive ones? One partial explanation that comes from an American American psychologist, social psychologist, Leon Festinger, who came up with cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance. If you remember back when we were talking about motivation, your book talked about motivation. We have that homeostasis, right? We have that middle ground where things kind of feel normal. If you can kind of regurgitate your ideas, your pictures about that thermostat, right, where we want to kind of live in the middle, that's kind of what cognitive dissonance is, right? His theory begins with the notion that we all we experience discomfort or dissonance when our thoughts or beliefs or behaviors are inconsistent with each other. So basically, we don't like to confuse ourselves. So let's say, for example, we have our value. Whatever that value is, maybe we aren't a violent person, right? And then we have our thoughts and behaviors over here. Now, there's a lot of stuff that comes up for this, especially as a therapist. I see this a lot. I see where people's values are, maybe it's not, and I'm going to get a little serious about this, is not to commit suicide. You could hear a lot of people that would say, oh, I would never do that. I would never do that. But when their thoughts become so far that it pulls away, like if they're starting to think about suicide or think about something unnatural or unsafe, the difference here really kind of pulls, it's kind of a tug of war match between them. So what we tend to do is pull this, we lessen this gap here so that our values and thoughts or behaviors are more aligned with each other, even if this is a value that we said we would never believe in, right? And for example, if go back to our buddy Philip, that we see at the party, is generally considered to be a peaceful person, but finds himself suddenly punching his friend over, over a spilt drink or something at that party. He's likely experiencing some level of cognitive dissonance. So by Festinger's thinking, Philip might relieve his tension by actually modifying his beliefs, right? The actions and the thoughts, they come first. So it's easier to move our actions, move our values to where our beliefs and our actions are. All right. So in order to match his actions, he's already committed. He's telling himself, turns out I'm not such a nice guy after all. Maybe I'm actually a bully. On the other hand, he might resolve his internal tension by changing how he thinks about the situation. He might still think of himself as a peaceful person, but realize that an unusual situation led to an unusual action. Like he had a bad day and he was maybe hit his mom's car, or his friend was just asking for it, right? So he can keep being the ordinary peaceful guy he was before, and it's kind of like an inverted fundamental attribution error, right? If you think about that, he's changing his own opinion of himself, if you think about it. So attributing a person's actions mainly to the situation instead of the personality. Not saying, oh, I'm a bad guy, but I just had a bad day, and he's justifying it. Kind of like what we do to justify our own actions. And think about that as you maybe have had some kind of internal conflict where you did something that you would morally say, that's nothing I would do, but you did. And then kind of that thought process as to how you arrived to that and justified it and walked away feeling like, that your disposition wasn't really hurt. So anyway, that's an example of cognitive dissonance. All right. So let's kind of look at the other side of things, kind of more of the situational. So if somebody in a position of authority, like I mentioned before, about if I showed up in a white coat and started talking about medical stuff, we see it all the time. We see it in our television ads, right? How many of you maybe have seen like a drug company, I'm trying to think of the head stuff, the Progenics, I think is what it's called. It's supposed to improve memory. You have a doctor, it says doctor on their title, and they've got a lab coat on, right? They're wearing that lab coat for a reason. They're appealing to your senses and telling you that they're credible, right? So if somebody in authority told you to stop walking on the grass, you would stop walking on the grass, right? And if they told you to help somebody's grandmother cross the street, or pick up dog's poop, or put your shoes on before you go into a store, you probably comply. So what I would like to do, I've got another video here to kind of illustrate what happens with compliance. Actually, I have two videos. I'm just gonna, in the interest of saving time, I'm just gonna show one. And maybe some of you have already seen this. Is the video showing?
Yeah.
What it says, game one?
Yeah, it's just played.
Okay, good.
Question. We set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do?
This is so
We
funny.
kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think right now.
All right. So, yeah, some pretty powerful stuff, right? How many of you enjoyed that? Have you seen that before?
I thought that was really funny.
Yeah, it was really cancel. Sorry, let me get out of this. Otherwise, it's going to continue playing screens. All right. Back into my screen. All right, so social conformity, right? We've seen this throughout history, and probably one of the most notable experiments was a man named Stanley Milgram, who began what would become probably one of social psychology's most famed and chilling experiments. So Milgram began his work during the World War II Nazi war criminal when Adolf Eichmann, his defense was he was only taking orders to commit all those atrocities. So with that in mind, Stanley Milgram recruited 40 males who volunteered using a newspaper ad, similar to what we saw in the Stanford prison experiment, and built a phony shock generator. And on this generator, it had a scale of 30 switches that could supposedly deliver shocks in increments of 30 volts to 450 volts, labeled with terms like light shock to dangerous shock to simply, and they had XXX, which he paired the participant with somebody that was also the student. And he asked, he wore a lab coat, and his lab assistant also wore a lab coat. And they told them that it would be okay, that this was part of learning. And he found that a majority of the people, a vast majority, almost 2/3 of the participants, ended up delivering a maximum of 450 volts, which they assumed was killing the other person. There's a great video out there called The Experimenter. And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but highly recommend it. It's a great movie, a little artsy, but I think it really depicts this very well. And if we had more time, I would probably show you some a little bit more in-depth experiment about it. But what it did, Milgram's path-breaking work sheds some serious harsh light on the enormous power of two key cornerstones, the topic of social psychology: social influence and we all conform to some sort of social norms, right? And it's easy for us to say, we would never do that. We would never do that. But, the studies show we do. We know how to act in certain groups or settings. It's ingrained in us because we are a pack animal, by and large, right? How likely you're to laugh if you see somebody else laughing, or nod your head when they're nodding. In this way, group behavior really can be contagious. And you think about that. Maybe you've gone to a play or a speech or something where everybody gets up and applauds. Maybe you didn't even like it. Maybe you didn't even understand what they're talking about, but you get up and you applaud anyway. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, you're connecting with your group, you're connecting with your peers, which is equally important to us, right? Because we've recognized the power in numbers, okay? So in reference to conformity, we also tend to really conform if we're from a culture that puts particular emphasis and respect for social standards. This might sound a little bit familiar, right? Like all of high school, really, or maybe if you're in a fraternity, big companies that you work for, any group that you've ever been a part of. Classic experiments of Milgram and even Ash, which your book talked about, show us that people conform for lots of different reasons, but they both underscore the power of situation in the conformity, whether the situation elicits it or not, or even if the person is strong-willed, as we saw in that video, people tend to conform. But of course, groups influence behavior in more ways than just conformity and obedience. For example, we may perform better or worse in front of a group. This is called social facilitation, and it's what we might say help you sprint that last 100 meters of a race if people are cheering you on. But it's also what can make you nervous, or even nervous enough to forget the words of a recital or a piece that you played on the piano thousands and thousands of times. But you're supposed to be doing that in front of the crowd, which might affect your performance. But that's what can happen in front of a group. What happens when you're actually part of a group? Do you think harder or work harder, or do you start lacking? Many of you are going through these group projects in our class. One study found that if you blindfold students, hand them a rope and tell them to pull as hard as they can in a game of tug of war, the subjects will put less work if they think that they're part of a team instead of pulling by themselves. In fact, about 20% less, as it turns out. This tendency to exert less effort when you're not individually accountable is called social loafing, and that's pretty interesting. And I think your book highlights a lot of examples about that. The people not doing what they're supposed to be doing because nobody else is. They look at power in numbers. Somebody else will take care of that. That's really social loafing, and hopefully none of you have that going on with your group assignments, right? But a group's ability to either arouse or lessen our feelings. Oops, I meant to write that. Social loafing. Okay, and that could be include diffusion of responsibility even. But a group's ability to either arouse or lessen our feelings of personal responsibility can make us do more dangerous things than just, phone in some group homework assignment, right? Many of you may have been part of that, where somebody dared you to do something on the playground, like eat a piece of chewed gum or put your nose in somebody else's sock or something, right? It can lead us to de-individualization or de-individuation, not individualization, or the loss of self-awareness. We see that in social media all the time. People jumping on the bandwagon and criticizing something or somebody even. And restraint that can occur in group situations. Being part of a crowd can create a powerful combination of arousal and anonymity, which is really arousal and anonymity. It's really part of, we talked a little earlier about riots and lynch mobs and online trolling. People that don't generally act that way in a group, the less individual they feel, the more they're at the mercy of the experience of the group, whether it's good or bad, which is kind of frightening. So kind of keep that in mind as people, as you see people on the streets, okay? All right, so when we talk about, I do want to kind of go through and consider what some of these group dynamics look like. All right, it should come as no surprise that attitudes and beliefs we bring into a group grow stronger, and when we talk with others who share them, this process psychologists know as group polarization. Polarization, okay. So group polarization, it really translate into a nasty us versus them dynamic. And we might see that a lot, right? We tend to be competitive in our nature, right? And what is great polarizing groups, right? The internet. The internet has made it easier than ever to connect like-minded people and magnify their inclinations. We're seeing that a lot with what's QAnon, right? For example, maybe some other groups out there that you're either part of or you've really maybe you've seen advertisements for, or other people that are in that. This can, of course, breed haters like racists and may become more racist in the absence of conflicting viewpoints, right? But it can and often does work for good, promoting education, crowdsourcing things like fundraising and organizing people to fight all kinds of terrible things in the world, right? So it's good and bad, but the important key here is have all the information available to you. And when we got into earlier discussions in this class, we talked about critical thinking. Critical thinking really helps with combating some of these bad traits that group dynamics foster. And group dynamics can not only affect our personal decisions, but they can also influence really big decisions on a larger, even national scale, right? think about, your book used the term groupthink. Does anybody care to share what groupthink is, either from reading? Okay, nobody. So groupthink is really a term coined by social psychologist Irvin Janis. And it's used to describe what happens when a group makes bad decisions because they're too caught up in a unique internal logic of their group. When the group gets wrapped up in itself and everybody agrees with each other, no one stops to think about their perspectives. And we've seen this throughout history. We've seen it in a lot of examples. As a result, you get some big and bad ideas, including some enormous historical fiascos like the Watergate cover-up and Bay of Pigs invasion, and even the Chernobyl nuclear reactor accident. And maybe some of you, if you have Netflix, you saw that recent Challenger. I can't remember the name of the Challenger.
I live right up the river from 3 Mile Island. So.
Okay. So yeah, you probably know the history behind 3 Mile Island is that there was a little bit of complacency there. Yeah, and that put us into not nearly as bad as Chernobyl, but same idea.
No,
but going back to,
if it was like Chernobyl, I wouldn't be able to live here.
Well, I think they shut it down. Yeah. But how about the Challenger? Did anybody watch the Challenger documentary? That was an example of groupthink, right? Because they had all the indications pointed to bad things possibly happening. The weather wasn't right. The frost was below their normal level. But hey, we're NASA. We're big and badass, and we're going to do awesome things regardless. We're not going to let a little frost stop us, even though these O-rings are rated at a certain temperature. So that's an example where groupthink really turns dangerous. Okay. So I am actually going to stop here. Does anybody have anything to add or any questions about what we covered?